The history of the labor movement needs to be taught in every school in this land. We need to know our roots. As they say, we learned about roots, didn't we, in 1976. We need to know who we are, what we are, where we come from, how we got here. You've heard me say this before. It is imperative. It is a part of American history. This great nation wasn't built just because somebody sat behind a table and finagled. And even finance, important as finance is, and it is important. Important as planning is, it is important. Important as design is, and it is important. Ultimately, it's the worker. It was the worker that built the railroads, that dug the tunnels, that dredged the rivers, that built the ports, that built the huge skyscrapers, put in the highways, and built the homes.
Welcome to the Chains of Freedom, Labor Day edition. I hope that won't make you feel proud inside. That was Hubert Humphrey. Thank you, Mr. Humphrey. Labor Day, Labor Day, Labor Day. Today is a day for you people. It's for me, it's for you. The construction worker, the custodian, the launderer, the laborer, the burger flipper, the oil worker, the factory worker, the assembler. Any walk of life, if you have to strap on your shoes, your boots, your Crocs, and get to work and get your hands dirty, just know that you are the one who built America. You're the one who put it all together. You're building tomorrow. But as you know, this is Chains of Freedom, so we're going to talk about yesterday. We're going to talk about our past. We're going to take up Mr. Humphrey's advice, and we're going to explore some of the history of our labor movements and what it applies to us today. Some quick facts. The reason why we have 8-hour days, weekends off, benefits, pensions, well, pensions arguably have been murdered in their bedwake, but we still have retirements, we have vacations, we have a higher standard quality of life as the bar is raised ever more. But we also likewise have this, I guess you might say, opposing movement that's trying to convince us that we have it too good, we have it too easy, we're entitled. We're not entitled, folks. Our forefathers, our labor forefathers, and our American forefathers have fought very hard to get us where we're at, and we should obviously celebrate the holiday, barbecue, enjoy your family, enjoy the day. And remember, it's in our national fabric to want to work, to want to build better, not just for our country, but for ourselves, for our families, for our homes, for our communities. And don't let anybody convince you different. There is not a class of people in this country that don't want to work, that don't want to excel, that don't want to grow and move up the chain and find that their legacy doesn't end necessarily in the poverty-stricken ghettos and slums and hoods and barrios across this country. Because this country's always promised that we can be anything we want to be if we put our mind to it, we put the work behind it. And as being a labor force, as being, blue collars, brown collars, white collars. Well, let me back up for a second here. The blue collar and the white collar, we all know this is. So I mentioned the brown collar. What is the brown collar? Well, let me give you a little litmus test here. A little self-check here. See, brown collar is a term that I myself have coined because there's a whole underclass of people. You're not poor, you're not middle class. And so the best way to test this is if you missed out on a week's pay, would that be detrimental to you? Are you one paycheck away from complete destruction with everything you built? Are you the kind of person who cannot miss a day's work without having some kind of financial repercussions behind it? If you are, then you would be what I like to coin as the brown collar. The brown collar, also important, just like the blue collar. Blue collar class is shrinking. The blue collar class is dying. It's dying because too many people are getting swallowed up with stagnant wages and stagnant careers. And as the cost of everything goes up, and I don't have to explain to anybody here how much gas prices alone, cost of food, cost of living, cost of health benefits, everything's skyrocketing. Meanwhile, the rest of us, we're all kind of left here slowly watching the edge of the waterfall, you might say, all falling into the brown collar class, one at a time, slowly but surely, one paycheck away from oblivion. But even at the darkest of hours we're still in an infinitely better situation thanks to those who were willing to step up to the plate back in the past. Now, there's a little snippet here. In 1893, there was the Great Panic of 1893 is what they called it. It was a depression. It was arguably the worst depression in the United States history. This was a collapse of the rail systems. Now, whether you know it or not, this is pretty detrimental toward the end of the 19th century. The rail systems carried everything: mail, cargo, agricultural goods and services, industrial goods and services. During this industrial renaissance, our corporate overlords, they did what they do best. They play with money and inadvertently or advertently play with lives, and they make bad bets from time to time. The Panic of 1893 left an unemployment rate just out of this world. But out of this, we see evidence, as I said, that people aren't willing just to sit there and take it. Necessity is the mother of invention. So in 1894, Jacob Coxey, the very Coxey that had Coxey's army. Now, a lot of people are aware of Coxey or his army. This wasn't a rise to arms kind of story. This was an entrepreneurial spirit that decided he wasn't going to just sit there and wait for the jobs to come back. Like I said, this is during the Depression from the Panic of 1893. And he came up with this ingenious idea. Hey, we have so many unemployed in this country. We need to get back to work. I need to get back to work. My employees need to get back to work. And I look around and I see roads that need rebuilt, bridges that need erected, rail track that needs laid. There's a lot of civic infrastructure that we could be doing instead of sitting around waiting for the economy to come back. We need to have a change in Washington. And he decided to march on foot with his, at the time, started employees, down to Washington. He wanted to petition Congress to put some funding toward our national infrastructure. So he decides on foot he's going to move. He's going to march to Washington, D.C. Now, he came from Massillon, Ohio. So Massillon, Ohio to Washington, D.C. is roughly, it's a little over 350 miles. It's a long way on foot. He and his compatriots, they figured maybe if they could do at least 15 miles a day, that's still going to take a lot of days. Every 10 days, 150 miles. That's pretending you're not so freakishly tired from the time before. But as they went around from, stop to stop, they started rallying more people for their cause. They started making the newspapers. It was the thing of 1894, was Cox's army and how he's marching on Congress, marching on Washington. And the ironic thing is that, so there's this big old hype thing. He finally gets to Washington, and just as he's walking up to the podium so he could sit there and deliver his little spiel to petition Congress to sit there and fund infrastructure, he gets arrested. He gets arrested for walking on the grass. And he spent some time in jail. It's sad to say that was kind of the unclimatic end of Coxey's army. Small little snippet of history there but the ideas were there. We just don't always get to hear the ideas or even get to hear the outcome or the response of, say, Congress. At least not at those times. Clearly, we put a lot of emphasis in infrastructure now. It's the wheelhouse of even our commerce now, without the interstate program and the railways and everything. The railways themselves are quite an intriguing story. 1862 America, Union Pacific is credited to Thomas Durant, the lead stockholder. He was out of Iowa. But again, going back to Mr. Humphrey, his speech in the beginning here, these are important, but the laborers ultimately built the railways. It took some 20,000 laborers to put together the Union Pacific. And of these, it was a healthy mix of Chinese and Irish immigrants. The railway itself went over 1,000 miles, like 1,082 miles. It went from Omaha, Nebraska west all the way up through into Utah. It's said that they were able to lay 5 miles a day of track. Now, that's an incredible feat. That is a crazy, incredible feat. 5 miles a day of track. If you've ever tried to lift a railroad tie, in general, just even pick it up, put it down, that is, it's doable, but it's no easy feat. And then to sit there and lay the rails on top of it, tack down the tracks with the spikes and the hammers, and yeah, that is an incredible feat. It is a modern marvel, our rail system, to be sure. But sadly, out of these 20,000, they were losing into the hundreds, more than hundreds throughout this whole process. But they were able to achieve this in 6 years. So, I mean, you do the math. But we're going to jump back a little bit more. We're going to go a little bit further back here. Let's throw our admiration for the ladies who don't get enough credit for the labor movements. 1836, textiles was very big, particularly in Boston, Massachusetts, and like all capitalists and entrepreneurial spirits, like we are, you want to jump on the next big thing, make a good buck for yourself. It's not unlike remember the fidget spinners, how everybody jumped on board with the fidget spinners, and the next thing you know, they just like disappeared. I mean, they still make them, obviously, but I mean, it was like a hyper saturated market. And so this was kind of going on with textiles. Now, 1836 was a very, very different time. I don't think that needs that much explanation, but I mean, this is pre-Reconstruction, pre-Civil War. We'd only been a country for around 50 years already, and we're just entering this industrial renaissance to sorts, or at least I like to call it an industrial renaissance. But it was here that young women in New England were being recruited for this up-and-coming factory work. They were boarded by textile companies, corporations, I guess you might say is a better way to put it. And they're pulled all over New England, where they were, doing labor. They were working the looms. They were making fabrics. Harriet Hanson Robinson, being of the mature grown age for any laborer at 10 years old, was one such woman who wrote a memoir about the whole ordeal. I encourage, of course, read it for yourself. Good stuff there. But so what would happen is they'd recruit these young girls, this labor force, they would house them, and they would pay for the housing, and they'd go in and they'd do their work. Well, in a hyper-saturated market as it became, the companies, of course, they decided that they were going to cut wages, and not only cut wages, but also make these young women responsible for the cost of their own living. 25 cents a week, I think, is what the historical account is of the cost of the boarding for these young girls, which in 1836, 25 cents, I mean, that's even before the day of the nickel. You remember your grandparents always talking about coffee always costing a nickel, newspaper a nickel? You could get a whole meal for 25 cents. Well, 25 cents was the cost of boarding then, but they're pushing this cost of housing on these young ladies on top of talking about cutting their wages. Now, as you might imagine, this didn't go well with them. And they, the companies at the time considered that there's some 12 to 1,500 girls walked out. And as they walked out, is one of the first strikes of any labor movement. And of course, they downplayed it as just a simple gathering, but they were able to at least get their voices heard, at least for the meantime. Now, ultimately, this little display of protest, it burned out. Margaret Hanson Robinson's mother, of course, was treated different, I guess. She was, of course, she had to suffer for her daughter's participation in the whole deal by being turned away from the housing, because whereas Robinson was only 10 years old. They say her mother should have had control of her because she was just a kid. But they eventually went back to work. They didn't get any headway outside of marking that historical moment. But that historical moment kind of got people to thinking a little bit about their own quality of life and what they were willing to endure. So if in symbolism alone, it's just a great underscore as to the things to come. Because in the 1840s, they, with the spirit of better work conditions, and let me just let you know, there's documentation of what the work conditions were like for the mill girls. They were working 13 hours a day, 7 days a week. There's record accounts of some of the women saying that to be a poor peasant or a serf, poor peasant of Ireland or a Russian serf, was to have better work conditions as they worked from sun up to sundown, as opposed to these girls who are working 13-hour days round the clock. It was a living hell for these young ladies. But in the 1840s, of course, they got organized and they started their own union. So one of the first American unions, as far as labor force goes, was from the women of the early 19th century. So women paved the way, as they do with so many things. Now, that's not to say that all strikes were unsuccessful or that voices weren't heard. In 1835 Philadelphia, there was a labor strike to get 10-hour days and increased wages. If I let you know what the working conditions were for the average Joe, if you will, in the early 19th century, when you have to strike to get a 10-hour workday and increased wages, and you can only imagine what that was like for a lot of the corporations and companies and manufacturers of that period, when they're like, wait, you want to work less and get paid more? And we hear that all the time now, and we kind of scoff at the idea of it. And it's funny because in the 1830s, people are just like, nah, I've kind of had enough of this whole 12 hours, 7 days a week nonsense. Something's got to change here. But because that strike was successful in 1835, it wouldn't be till some 10 years later, of course, you start getting other states that start jumping into this too. New Hampshire and the Low Girls again finally start petitioning for a 10-hour workday themselves. And as you can see, it starts kind of gaining steam everywhere it goes. And it's surprise, like, okay, so 10 years at it, that's the time it takes, for things to circulate, news and word of mouth in the early 19th century. And you got to remember, everything was still handwritten letter back then. We didn't get the telegraph until around that same time. So, that's brand new technology. It's almost like when cell phones first came out and all we could really do is call, and you had T9 text, and that's cool and that's great and everything. But now we can send emails, we can send text messages, and of course you have social media, which is in its own world. Could you imagine the early labor movements of the 19th century if they had like TikTok or anything like that? Get out of here, forget it. But on that note, it wouldn't be until 1866 when Congress was pressured to do an 8-hour workday. Of course, this is kind of a lackluster effort. We didn't actually get a workday until the 20th century, which of course had its battles and its ups and downs, a lot of blood in there. We'll discuss a few of the happenings, but it wasn't until 1940 when we actually got the Fair Labor Standards Act, which was the 40-hour work week. So you're talking nearly 100 years from the textile workers of 1838 to 1940. 100 years from the adoption of a 10-hour workday into an 8-hour workday, which is crazy to think about. The U.S. government in 1890 started tracking the work hours of the manufacturing sector, which they found that the average manufacturing laborer would put in over 100 hours a week. So it was definitely long since due, and now there's people trying to say that the 8-hour workday is no longer relevant, or we should dismiss that as from times of lost. Obviously, that's nowhere near true. But you see, it was at the end of the 19th century when these men of enterprise, these company owners, these corporate heads, started really coming into problems, because it was in 1889, May Day, which is we know it as May Day, but it's the International Workers' Day became a thing globally. Of course, it wasn't a thing in America. As we know, Labor Day isn't anywhere near May. It's the first Monday of September. But this started kind of motivating people to demand more of their employers. They started demanding, fair working conditions. But let's not make the mistake of thinking that these employers, the manufacturing heads, the corporate heads, the business owners, they just sat there and took this laying down. They definitely fought back whenever there were work protests and strikes and walk-offs, and it wasn't like it is today where they would just hire scabs to come in and do the work while the negotiations of union contracts are still in play. They would call the police, they'd call the National Guard, and sometimes it was met with bloodshed and beatings and arrests. In 1894, there was a widespread railroad workers' strike and boycott, known as the Pullman Strike, which, of course, as we discussed with the Panic of 1893, if you shut down the trains, you're shutting down just about everything in this particular period of time. And this got so widespread and into a head that the police came and the president actually dispatched National Guard, and they began firing into 5,000 of them. The ones that didn't get shot got beat, and they had some 100 and some odd arrests. Particularly when they found out that, the hard way, the mail was stopped and commerce was stopped, and the trains just weren't going because the railway workers and the manufacturer laborers and workers, they all banded together to pull this strike off. It was in 1895 when the president finally decreed for the Declaration of Labor Day for the United States, and he declared that it should be the first Monday of September. Now, the Declaration of Labor Day, of course, for the American worker and laborer, didn't necessarily mean all that much still. Remember, in 1890, the average manufacturing worker was still putting in 100 hours a week. And this wasn't like outright slavery, but you definitely didn't have much else to do. You got to remember these major manufacturers that kind of build their own whole towns. You still see remnants of this today. You see the echoes of this today with like Detroit. Major auto manufacturer, while the city itself was kind of built around this corporation. Is the same thing with a lot of small rural places. It might be a food processing plant. It might be an auto manufacturer. Or it might be a major agrarian mill or something along those lines, where people, they have to work within their neighborhoods, or they live in their neighborhoods because of the work. And if it shuts down, they're out of work. But these manufacturing heads, these corporate heads, they disrupted the harmony of their human assets and labor assets by working them like this under the guise of payment. I mean, a lot of people don't realize that some people were getting paid in what they call corporate scrip. This was particularly popular with railway workers and miners and rural laborers. It was hard to ship money, especially in the end of the 19th century. I mean, it was just a perilous kind of deal. You had to ship actual cash to actual locations to pay people. So corporations would come up with what they called corporate scrip. Corporate scrip was basically monopoly money as printed by the corporation, and they'd pay you in this, and then you'd be forced to shop at their stores and buy their goods and shop at their clothing lines and what have you, because the corporation would bring it all in, and that's what you would have to choose from as far as what your needs were and your assets were. They very, very rarely got paid real money, which led to a lot of different problems. In 1914, you had the Ludlow Massacre, which Ludlow, Colorado, my home state, the governor dispatched the National Guard, and they murdered some 20-odd people, which I think the official record is 13 of which were women and children. And this was because they were unhappy with their work conditions in the mining camps in southern Colorado, coal miners, as it were. And so when they protested, this obviously led to them getting stamped out. Ludlow is a ghost town in Colorado now, but the memorial's still there. And despite all the protests and the strikes and the walkouts and the bloodshed and the battles between the law and order types and the workers, it wasn't until 1935 that we actually got unions signed into law. We didn't get unions signed into law. What we got is the right to collectively organize and negotiate our working conditions and wages. And that right there is the National Labor Relations Act, which also passed with the Social Security Act. But it ultimately established that we have a collective right to collectively bargain for our wages. And it's ever since that, I mean, unions started forming as early as 1900. A lot of people don't realize how old, if you're a union employee, you don't realize how old your union might be. But unions have been forming, as far as like official unions, as early as the turn of the 20th century. Now, some have suggested, of course, that the mob is the one who started labor unions. They had a hand, but they weren't the ones who started labor unions. I mean, women, children, you had the Newsies strike of the 1890s, right? They started a union. You have the steel workers, the meat packers, the farm workers. This farm workers one, obviously a little bit more, some of you might remember Cesar Chavez and his march. That was all about farm workers, union rights, and better working conditions. This has been an ongoing battle. Every step forward, of course, when it comes down to the working man, has also been about half a step back, 2/3 of a step back. Right to work policies, states passing a lot of anti-union laws, as well as on the national level passing anti-union laws, and sit there and say, well, you have a right to work without having to pay a union, or right to work laws like here in Colorado, where they sit there and say, well, you don't have to be in the union, but you are going to have to pay the dues. So, just a lot of weird loopholing, trying to find ways to weaken the union. And to be fair, the unions haven't done a whole lot for themselves as far as keeping a good name for themselves. I've worked on both sides of unions, and I can tell you some are better than others, but one thing I've noticed is that they themselves have kind of dropped the ball to some degrees, particularly with how they negotiate in regards to the upcoming generation. Some of these guys have been doing, well, for example, we'll say like the meat packers, they've been doing work for 20, 30 years with the union, and they've taken full advantage of the benefits of being in their union. But when it comes to negotiation time, they say, hey, well, let us old guys have this, and then the other guys have that. So unions haven't necessarily stood up to protect the up and coming generations of manufacturers, laborers, field hands, what have you. So that fight's always ongoing. And you might say, okay, Aaron, that's great. You demonstrated a lot of surface scratching on events throughout the 19th century, touched mildly on the early 20th century. What does that have to do with me today? Where exactly, so I have an 8-hour day, I have weekends off, and I get a barbecue on Labor Day. That's great. Or maybe you don't work for a union. Maybe you're even anti-union at this point of the discussion, irregardless. Unions have been able to set wages for non-union employees in their own industries as well. If you work for a non-union shop, for example, maybe we'll use the meat packers as an example. The union shops sitting there paying their guys maybe $18, $19 an hour today is why your shop now is willing to pay even $19, $20. And if it lets you know how against unions manufacturing still is, how against it is for collective bargaining, they openly oppose unions at every step of the way. Walmart will gladly close down, damn near burn down their own building before they allow their people to unionize. Amazon isn't much better in this regard. They so openly oppose unions that they pay millions of dollars in lobbying and legislation just to weaken unions as they stand. But let's not forget that it was the labor struggles that taught the average working citizen, average working American, man, woman, child, black, white, Asian, doesn't matter. It taught them that, individually, we can't get much done, particularly against a big manufacturing, big corporations, some of these monopolizing entities. But as a whole, as a collective whole, they can move mountains. They can really bend and force their way into better conditions for themselves and even for their neighbors as a communal whole. This also opened doors with this new radical thinking, if you will, that, maybe now I deserve a right to vote. Maybe I deserve a right to partake in the full benefits and protections of the U.S. Constitution. See, the American worker has been left out of a lot of various moments in history based on the fact that they were almost like a civic underclass. I mean, all men were created equal, but look at, we didn't get the 19th Amendment until well into the 20th century. 200 years gone by, they didn't get black voting rights until the 60s. They'd been freed, and in being freed for nearly 100 years, still didn't get the right to vote. And I might add, in 1968, when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, was actually during a sanitation workers' strike. A workers' strike. It wasn't an equality rally. It was a labor strike. And a lot of people they don't think they dismiss, but they tend to overlook Dr. King's work with labor and the right to want to work, the right to want to be productive, the right to want to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and make something of yourself as the American promise it offered every man, woman, and child in this country. She didn't mind working women until, of course, the women started to get loud. They started to get rowdy. And then in their mind, they're thinking, what's next? They're going to want to vote? Well, yes, they do want to vote, goddammit. And they got that. Granted, nearly 100 years later, the slaves wanted free. Well, what's next? They're going to want to have citizenship too. Well, here we are, 100 years later. Well, that's obviously been more than 100 years at this point. But these battles are still ongoing. I mean, look at child labor. Child labor was finally abolished in 1930. 1930. We've been working our kids, God knows how long prior to that. Hundreds of years prior to that. Until 1930 comes along and say, hey, you know what? We should probably not have these kids working in factories, working in fields, working in farms, doing man's work. The average American in the country couldn't even afford to have kids without their kids working. They needed some actual labor out of the child. There's reports of children working as young as 5 years old in the agrarian communities. And you heard the story about Ms. Robinson working at 10 years old in a textiles factory. And then even still, in 1970 was when we finally got OSHA, which kind of gave us the right to go ahead and work without being maimed and it going unaccounted for. So that's even newer still. And there's a lot of people out there who they kind of roll their eyes and, fuck OSHA. I got it, I get it. Sometimes it is kind of a headache to sit there and deal with that. But if it wasn't for OSHA, it would be okay if, say like when DuPont's plant had a chemical release and people died down in Texas. And they, if it wasn't for OSHA, those families probably would have never been compensated. Just a workplace accident. Shit happens, kind of a mindset. So it's been through the worker that we've had the right to vote. It's been through the worker that women's suffrage was able to take hold. It's been through the worker that the Cesar Chavez movement was able to take hold. It's been through the worker that the Civil Rights Acts of the 60s were able to take hold. Not because they necessarily had a voice in any one of these issues, but because at the same time the collective voice was these people in these industries. The blacks, the Mexicans, the Asians, the whites, the white women, Irishmen, German, just about any race that could be discriminated against. And this is definitely something we'll get into, not today, not in this cast. It's just the design of breaking up these groups so that way they're always pitted against one another. And when you start to understand why they did that, you can understand why they find unions so dangerous, because there isn't any one color that's working in a manufacturing plant. It isn't just white dudes building cars or black dudes packing beef or pork or food processing, whatever. It's not just Mexicans working in the fields. This is a collective whole, a collective underclass of folks that have had to lift themselves into a middle class, which is now starting to fall back into an underclass, a brown-collar class, because we need to know our roots. We need to know where or when it's our time to pick up the baton, like a relay race. This next generation, it's everything that our grandparents could have hoped for their children. We're everything our parents could have hoped for us. So that way our children, they too know that it's their turn. When it's their time to grab the baton, they can run with it with less obstacles, less oppression, less bloodshed, and they can hand off to our grandkids and our great-grandkids. That way our voices continue to be heard. It's important across the board. When I say workers, I mean you, I mean me. We're all the American worker in some regard or degree, and there's such a rich story, as I said before, of Labor Day and what it means and what it should mean, and how the fight continues regardless of what the day is or when the day was signed into law. A lot of people tend to think that once something becomes law, it's suddenly like it's over with, it's done with. There's hundreds of examples. I mean, just because they freed the slaves doesn't mean that they didn't find ways to recapture the slaves. Just because they said workers, the American worker deserves a better lifestyle doesn't mean that they automatically got a better lifestyle. It's been a fight. It will continue to be a fight. Be proud of what you do. Be proud of what you do regardless of what your walk in life is. You're building towards something better. You're building towards your legacy. You're building towards your future. You're building our future of tomorrow. And I highly encourage you look into more of these movements, because as far as I'm concerned, the American labor movements of history are the American people's history. There's plenty of great things that America has done. There's been plenty of great things that great Americans have achieved. But at the end of the day, when you come down to the underbelly of who we are as a nation, it's been the American worker. The American worker has been the one who's sat there and either foot the bill, built the bridge, or put in the sweat, blood, tears, and labor into making some of these dreams come true. So be proud of yourself on this day. Be proud of yourself, and never take a second back seat toward anybody who tells you shouldn't be proud of what you do to make your money. If anything, if there's any call of action for this, you should figure out how you can make it better for the next guy down the road. This is Chains of Freedom Labor Day edition. Y'all have a good holiday.